Yo sí estoy bien animada para el round 2 del COVID, RGA.
And you both look fabulous.
Thank you. That tells me
Fake it till you look great.
a lot of time and effort. You know?
Good color on you, Kata, as well. That green. It is polka dot day. You both have polka dots. That's what you were saying earlier. I didn't get it. Okay. I wasn't looking. My eyes are still opening. All right. And I'm drinking very strong Colombian coffee.
Way to go.
Okay, here we go. We have 9. Am I?
Welcome everyone to the webinar regarding the rapid gender analysis for the refugee and migrant crisis in South America. Let's wait a couple of minutes before to start to allow rest of participants join the space. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this space today. This webinar that will present the results from the regional rapid gender analysis focused on the refugee and migrant crisis from Venezuela, scooping in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and for sure Venezuela. It's a pleasure for us as CARE presenting today these results, such a common effort from different countries and organizations at the local level. Today, I will co-host this space with Tatiana Bertolucci, and I would like to introduce her. She is the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. She has been working with CARE since 2012 in different roles. In the regional management team, and previously as executive manager for CARE Brazil. Tatiana is a feminist and committed to gender justice and to inclusive governance, having researched participatory policy and poor and gender budgeting in different regions. She has held a range of positions working for organizations in Spain, Indonesia, and in her home country of Brazil. Tatiana has a master's degree in Latin America Studies from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and a specialization in communications culture from Sao Paulo University. Please, Tatiana, if you want to welcome us also.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this space. Thank you for joining us on presenting the results of this rapid gender analysis that is focusing in the 4 countries Catalina mentioned. It's just a real pleasure to hold this space, to have and share the results of this exercise and research. I just want to recognize before we start that this is a huge effort, and I want to acknowledge the CARE teams in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru that have dedicated a lot of time and energy to this work, but also to our partners in all of the countries, and especially mentioning el Centro de Justicia y Paz, CEPAS, the Organización Oportunidad AC, Asociación Civil Uniandes, y la Fundación Quimera, Plaperts, Fundación Nuevos Horizontes, Fundación Alas de Colibrí, Organización Diálogo Diverso, and certainly a lot of other peers and partners that have been putting effort and contributing to this. It was a process led out of CARE together with those partners, and there is a huge acknowledgement for everyone's efforts on putting this together. We hope to share the results of this in the next hour maximum, so that we have at least a half an hour for conversation. The reports are available, and we'll be sharing the link with you all both in English and Spanish, and we are also recording this webinar so that you can access and share the information later on if needed. So welcome everyone, and with that I pass back to you, Catalina, so that you can present yourself and start.
Thank you, Tatiana. So my name is Catalina Vargas. I am the Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for CARE in Latin America and Caribbean. It's a pleasure to me today presenting these results. As Tati mentioned, today we're going to present all the information compiled from 4 countries, but definitely you can find more detailed one in the national RGAs that will represent the national context from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. We can pass to the first slide. What are the objectives for today? Basically, first of all, is to understand how roles and relations have changed as a result of the refugee and migrant crisis for women, men, girls, boys, and LGBTQ people. There is one of the key results that you will find during the presentation, and for sure broadly share the recommendations for the humanitarian community, but also for different actors at the local and regional level that are involved to this response, in how we can improve the quality of the response, make it more accessible, but also fill in the real gaps on the field. We can go to this next slide. So before to start, I would like to present you what is a rapid gender analysis. There is a tool developed from CARE that it's aimed to identify key issues contributing to gender inequalities, many of which also contribute to poor development outcomes. This is a process to explore how gender power relations give rise to discrimination, subordination, and exclusion in society, particularly when it overlaid across other areas of marginalization due to class, ethnicity, caste, age, disability, status, sexuality, etc. This is a process that seeks to collect, identify, but also examine and analyze different kind of informations on different roles of people across genders. RGA, or rapid gender analysis, primarily seeks to understand three main questions. First of all, what are the gender-related rights denials in a given context, understanding that from the experience, the gender roles tend to be more complicated when the crisis arrived, and criticize those roles. Secondly, how will gender relations affect the achievement of sustainable results depending in a slow or a rapid onset crisis? And third one, how will proposed results affect in the relative status of men and women? Understanding that the crises are also opportunities to make sustainable change in those kind of structural problems related to gender roles. The rapid gender analysis, as the name mentioned, is a rapid process, and it's interesting to understand that this is also a document that aims to be updated regarding different elements are changing or affecting the context. So this is not a final document or a final version. We expect definitely with the partners and the rest of the stakeholders having an update version in the coming months. What are the 5 steps of this process? So the objective is provide essential information about gender roles and responsibility. So first of all is find existing analysis and data on gender relations that is based on secondary information and secondary data. We as a CARE use the gender in briefs that are key documents that are examined and related. What are the gender contexts in those emergency situations? This gender in brief compiles and analyzes existing secondary gender information and present this information in 2-page documents. So it's a short one and agile, which contain sex and age disaggregate statistics and gender analysis from before the crisis. So it makes links to key reference documents and existing care programs, and also shows and recognize that we are not the only one talking about gender, and also based on the information provided from other organizations. Second step, it's collect additional data through gender assessment and going to primary data source. So the RGA tools are used to gather information from women, men, boys, and girls about the impact of a crisis. We use different tools to connect information, so it depends on the context, mainly surveys or focus groups, mapping tools, individual stories. It depends on how accessible are those sources of information, and that's a key part where we aim to involve local women's organization to empower them not only as part of the service, but also as part of the analysis. That is exactly the third step. The analysis of results and compared to pre-crisis data. So gender data that has been collected using these surveys or focus group is useless without analysis. So the analysis of gender data is really important for a number of reasons, including provide practitioners with an understanding of changes to gender relations and how those relations are affecting programming. To use the data and information generated from data collection process to form recommendation and practical ones to understand gaps, but also make adjustments in the humanitarian programming to achieve a better quality of response. The fourth step is exactly that, how we are producing practical recommendations. And those recommendations are addressed for sure for humanitarian actors, but not only, also for local and regional governments to engage them as part of stakeholders, including local actors, because this is the most important step to completing the rapid gender analysis. And it's providing a clear recommendation that will definitely improve or at least address some of the problems or gaps that we identify during that data primary collection and for sure the analysis. This also includes the capacity and contribution of women on different groups that we include on the process. And remember that the purpose of collecting this information is to improve the response and how we can link with different partners, as I mentioned, in this specifically crisis from the regional platform, but also from the national ones where we are part. 5th step, and I think also really, really important, is how we can share that with other actors. And this is exactly the reason why we are together today, trying to share broadly those recommendations, because the idea is that you can share also with your colleagues or other actors that you consider relevant. We'll appreciate those informations to adapt or address better the gaps that we found. We can go to the next slide. In terms of methodology, so this process started last year in June. As I mentioned at the beginning, we did 4 rapid gender analyses, 1 per country, including Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We include 17 geographical areas during the process, most of them cities, but also rural areas, depending on the capacity also to cover from the partners. This has been really, really interesting for us, but also valuable when we also include the women's organization as the leaders on the field process, collecting the information, but also defining the tools and analyzing the information. This has been critical and can be made a value add and a difference from other processes that are more centered to the care staff. So we have real valuable information because they know really well the context, they are part of the context, and involve them has been a really value add for us. And you can, as Tati mentioned at the beginning of this call. The period was almost 6 months since we start. It was not a parallel RGAs, but designing the tools, collecting information, and producing the final report. The people that has been included as participants on the RGA, we are talking about 64% of women and 34% of men. A small percentage of LGBTQI population that definitely is related to how they recognize themselves and how they feel comfortable to mention that they are part of this group, because it's pretty sensitive in the region, still a lot of discrimination, so we can also interpret those data like that. The primary data collection includes 2,618 surveys and 19 key information interviews where we include partners, UN, governments, and other stakeholders like community leaders or key participants to provide definitely important information. And the focus group that are really, really important because it's also identified as a safe space for groups to share broadly where are their concerns or how they are perceiving the context. So we did an effort including a specific focus group for pregnant women or adolescents, trying to involve all of the vulnerable groups during this process. We can go to the next one. So in terms of the background, and as I'm sure you are aware, an ongoing political and economic crisis in Venezuela have led to hyperinflation, breakdown in public systems and services, start to increase in poverty levels. Food insecurity is one of the main reasons, and gender-based violence, and other forms of violence for sure since 2016, that then these reasons forced to migrate more than 5.1 million until June of this year. This has resulted, in the biggest displacement for Latin America in the recent history, causing definitely not only for Latin America but also for in a worldwide perspective one of the more massive displacement process. According to the R4V regional platform, there were almost 17 countries that are hosting the people that decide to start the migration process. And 3 million of the 5.1 are host in 3 countries that are Colombia, Peru, and for sure Ecuador. So we can see how the impact has been also impact the hosting communities. Since mid-year in 2019, some restrictive policies have been in place from governments that definitely increase the vulnerabilities for those who start the pathway by walk. Most of them in an irregular status, and they stay stuck trying to get the border, and most of the cases trying to reach their family that start the pathway before them some time ago. So when we are talking about 5.1 million, we need to also highlight that those are the official numbers. Those are the official reports, but definitely given to the situation that I mentioned on the policies across the borders, most of them are using informal cross borders, being exposed to different kind of vulnerabilities, but also increasing a percentage of people that are not reflected on those numbers. In average, we are talking about 50% of irregular migrants and refugees across the region that for sure are increasing the gaps in terms of service accesses, but also being victims of xenophobia. That is one of the phenomena across the countries right now. 2020 bring the COVID situation that definitely has made the things worse for them, creating a forced return process. They look for came back to the country without no measure of protection and being exposed to more vulnerabilities under the lockdown and the different measure in place from governments. So right now we are saying that more than 70,000 of Venezuelans reached Venezuela since the beginning of the year because of the COVID situation. But we are not pretty sure what are the protection situation and how they are getting to the border with all the challenge that they are facing through the pathway. We can go to the next slide. The crisis of Venezuela has led to stark declines in health, safety, and quality of life for millions of people. Poverty levels in the country increased from 41% of households and it was in 2016 to 52% in 2018. So various health and social indicators in the countries reflect this decline. Maternal mortality rates are increased from relatively stable, 68 more or less deaths per 100,000 births in 2015, show us how the situation is critical inside Venezuela. So while migratory flows from Venezuela early in the crisis considered largely of men professionals with different skills and funds to support themselves, this makeup has changed in the recent years with more and more Venezuelans, women and girls arriving in all the three host communities. So we are looking at women pregnant with children going by walk, facing all those kind of vulnerabilities that Tatiana will precise in the next slide. And also I want to highlight that there is a 30% around of under 18 years old minors that are in some cases unaccompanied. And I let you imagine what kind of vulnerabilities they also are facing during this forced migration process. I will stop there and I will pass to you, Tati.
Thanks, Catalina, and I'll be sharing with you the main impacts that we found and also recommendations and conclusions. Next slide. In order to do this analysis, we will basically be looking into these areas: the gender roles and responsibilities before and after the crisis, capacities and coping mechanisms that people are recurring to, the status of women's participation and leadership, protection, and observations into different sectors that we are programming on as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, gender roles and responsibilities, if we look into the gender norms before the crisis among the Venezuelan population that we've researched, what we can find is that we had a very traditional gender roles and social norms. We know the very machista culture in Latin America, and what we found was basically men being responsible for the decision making and being the key providers for the families, while women were mostly in charge of the care work inside of the houses. I think it's important to highlight that in some of the focus groups discussions that we held with Mayo Venezuelan, several beliefs came up from phrases like cooking is the women's work, or that it is acceptable for a man to sleep with other women, but women should be, you know, taking care of themselves and looking nice and not, you know, not having sexual encounters out of the relationship. So from those type of comments to sometimes it's actually good that you hit your wife or your woman. And those are a good portrait of this very machista culture that I was mentioning previously. I think that it's also important to highlight that men in heterosexual couples usually earned more than their wives on average as part of this traditional gender dynamic. On the other hand, women, the basic areas of decision-making that they would hold were around some of the resources related to the house, and especially the food that would go into the household. In that sense, it is one of the areas that we saw some differences as the crisis unfolded. So the Venezuelan women that we surveyed after the crisis unfolded, started to claim control over non-food assets such as the television or the furniture, because they had to sell those assets to generate income or cash needed to buy food. As Catalina mentioned, there is a difference between the first waves of migration that were largely made up of men migrating to provide for their families. That's the case of 59% of the men that we researched in Ecuador, and 63% of the men, for instance, that we researched in Peru. Nevertheless, the following migratory flows move towards being a more male-dominated with human girls and boys, and complete families moving to rejoin the family members from the first wave. And that's, for instance, the case of almost 6% of the women that we researched in Peru. How did this transform with the crisis? First of all, inside of Venezuela, what we saw is that as men migrated after the first wave, women became the responsibles for the household, which meant that they needed to find income earning activities, but also they were responsible for the decision-making inside of the household, which is a transformation on their traditional gender roles. Nevertheless, that is on top of their existing roles as caretakers and the care work that they were doing. So it's also charging much more women in their time and responsibilities as being the leaders of the household. So basically, they became the active head of their households while they were still in Venezuela, and the men had migrated. We also saw that continued to be true as they reached the receiving countries, and that dynamic of decision-making and being part of the income earning members of the family remained part of their behaviors when they arrived in their new countries. Many of them continue being the heads of their households in the host country as well, and being the economic provider for the family. I think finally, it's also important to highlight that after all, what we are seeing now inside of Venezuela is that there is an additional care burden for the women that remained in the country. So we know that, for instance, in Peru, 1 out of every 5 migrant groups traveling reported that they had left children or other minors with their families back in Venezuela, with other relatives taking care of those children. And those are usually women older women, you know, the abuelas, the aunts that are taking care, which is an increased care burden for them. So we are also quite concerned with the extra level of work that the whole migration process generated for women inside of Venezuela. The whole care work that women are doing, both inside of Venezuela, but also in the countries where the migrants and refugees are arriving, mean that there is an extra charge of women unpaid care labor, and that is an essential mechanism for allowing households to migrate and establish their lives and economically survive in the countries that they arrive, but also back in Venezuela, which increases the workload of women, the workload for women even more, and also generate different barriers for accessing safe and dignified work, health, and others, as we will see as we move forward. What we saw is that with COVID restrictions, that those differences are even more highlighted, with the income becoming a real challenge. The care work of women becomes even more necessary because the number of hours or other strategies that are needed to survive are increasing the burden as well. Talking about capacities and coping mechanisms, and we can go for the next slide. Inside of Venezuela, the crisis has led to a very precarious local labor market and a reliance on international remittances. We know that that's more significant for women, and 7% approximately of the women that we surveyed reported that they received remittance, and only 3% of the men. Also, only 15% of the female heads of households reported that their income was sufficient to cover their needs, which is slightly higher compared to the 26% of the male heads of households. Nevertheless, both men and women have seen decreases in the regular and professional work opportunities and have been obliged to transition into a much more informal market and trade, and sales-related work. In the host countries, we know that employment opportunities are limited and mainly on the informal economy, and often it's quite risky, especially for human and LGBTQI+ populations. They have less access to employment and less access to income than men. And if you compare the data in all of the countries that we've seen, there is an important gap between the income opportunities between men and women. Also, the type of work that is being offered and carried out is different according to gender. So many of the Venezuelans are making their income in the informal sector, either begging or doing recycling and working as street vendors. For men, also men and adolescent boys, there is opportunities engaging in construction work. Some, unfortunately, as part of the coping mechanisms, are involved in smuggling of fuel, contraband, which is a situation that increases the vulnerability, especially of young men, to the recruitment into criminal gangs and armed groups. Women, on the other hand, are being more, having more opportunities as domestic workers or working on bars, and as a coping mechanism, unfortunately, having to recur to transactional sex for survival, which is also true for LGBTIQ+ individuals. In terms of barriers to find jobs and income opportunities, the main issue that we've found is the nationality and the immigration status. 15% of the men, of the people without an income in Peru, reported that they were refused a job just due to their nationality. But women and girls face additional burdens, including the child care and the care load that we were just talking about, that prevent them from seeking work because they need to do the domestic care work as well as sexual harassment when looking for a job. For those that are working, many are forced to work into very long hours to make ends meet. So for instance, in Peru, 55% of the respondents reported that they are working more than 60 hours a week. What that means is 14 hours a day. Again, that situation has an impact for women in a different way, because that means that their care work needs to be carried out for longer during the day. And there is a huge cost associated with pursuing income generating opportunities. Next slide. In terms of participation and leadership, what we found is that women in Venezuela have seen an increase in the reproductive burdens and care tasks in the household. And that meant also higher restrictions to their capacity and freedom to organize and mobilize because of the time dedication between one or the other. We also have seen that Venezuelan women that are leaders and human rights defenders are harassed and persecuted, which is an important barrier inside of the country. For the humanitarian responses, and I think this is a call out for all of us that are in this call, women and girls reported that they have not been consulted as part of the humanitarian response design, even though they have a huge role in leading the local responses to the community needs. For example, in Colombia, the scale and complexity of the crisis has led humanitarian organizations to focus on the basic meeting life-saving needs and deprioritizing the participation of migrants and refugees in the humanitarian response. As a result, women, men, boys, and girls have few or no mechanisms today to voice their views and concerns. Also, even though this region has many long-standing civil society and women's organizations with high capacity installed, including those that are addressing the needs of people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, these organizations remain very underrepresented in the response and associated decision-making. So there's a huge call for rethinking the way we are designing and making the decisions around this response to be much more inclusive of the local civil society organizations, but also the migrants and refugees themselves in the process. I think it's also important to highlight that COVID-19 made this an even greater challenge. So RGA that we are right now conducting in Colombia shows that migrant and refugees participation in both the humanitarian space, but also the basic public spaces that they were being called to participate became extremely restricted because of the mobility restrictions that we are seeing. So basically they were, some of the women are reporting that at least before COVID, they could go to a municipal meeting and have a voice, even if we didn't have, a chance to vote, at least we had the chance to voice up our concerns. But with the quarantine measures, they basically lost that space as well. So something to be called out as part of the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. On protection, and that's the next slide, I think there are several issues in protection, and I think that's one of the areas that we need to increase our capacity of respond, and we see that in the recommendations. But inside of Venezuela, the respondents reported that their main concern was being attacked by people or groups, with violence by authorities being the second main concern. Women perceive that they are facing higher risks to themselves than men in every single country. So 31% of all individuals that we surveyed in Venezuela also reported that they knew someone who had experienced some sort of violence in the past year, which is quite high. Pregnant women reported that they don't feel safe in their own houses, that they fear that state agents will be knocking on their doors. And adolescents report concerns that are related to the limited schooling opportunities, having to enter to a very informal labor market, and the unmet sexual and reproductive health needs with high pregnancy rates and GBV among adolescents as well. For the people that are en route, or los caminantes, what we saw is that many of those who made the long journey to Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru has experienced violence in the route or after their arrival, including xenophobic attacks, robberies and physical assault, psychological violence, sexual violence, and extortion. Women have reported the highest level of sexual violence, while men reported robberies and fights as the biggest safety concerns that they had in the pathway to arrive in the hosting countries, including the fights based on xenophobic sentiments. Venezuelan migrants traveling through these areas already faced heightened protection risks, including human trafficking and various forms of gender-based violence, such as sexual exploitation and slavery. And women and girls are the primary victims of those types of violence. I think it's worth mentioning again that with COVID-19 and the close of the borders in all of the countries, that increased the need of people crossing through the informal and irregular ways, which basically made them even more vulnerable to exploitation from criminal groups that are present on those borders. So it's a higher concern on protection for people that are still trying to cross the borders, either coming outside of Venezuela or trying to go back into the country. I think that's also worth to mention that when Venezuelans arrive in their destination, they do not have the minimum information and the support networks that they would need, and also not the financial resources to obtain the appropriate visas, and many of them also do not have some of the requirements that are being asked. What is being showed is that some of the authorities exploit their position of power over migrants at the border crossings to make money. And even where there is no exploitation, or when that doesn't happen, the migration services many times are reported to be disrespectful and unsupportive of the people migrating, and focusing basically on the ones that meet the visa requirements and ignore the needs of those that are in need of protection, including unaccompanied children and adolescents, which is absolutely concerning as well in terms of the needs to work with the local governments that have stepped up and have tried to put some systems in place, but is still not meeting the needs from the populations that we are discussing here. There is a very important lack of information and obstacles as well to regularize the documentations, which actually limits their access to various other systems and supports from work, health, education, justice, and others. So in Peru, for example, more women than men are traveling under irregular migratory status, which means that they are also more impacted. Finally, there is a huge amount of reports on mistreatment due to their nationality. And that is also gendered across the region, with women being treated as being mistreated for their gender, while men being attacked by claims of other types of criminal attitudes. In terms of GBV, all the 4 countries confirmed that gender-based violence is widely normalized and justified, and the gender-based violence risks is even higher for migrants and refugees. Again, common across all of the 4 countries, there are risks of exploitation and trafficking that we were talking about, to the point that in Ecuador, for instance, in the focus groups discussions that we had, the majority of women who entered in the country through irregular routes have experienced sexual assaults and for other forms of GBV. In Colombia, women sometimes are offered shelter by Colombian men, but they are drawn into situations of domestic servitude, including sex slavery. And for all of the countries, Venezuelan women searching for employment also reported encountering harassment or job offers that come with expectation of sexual favors as part of their daily lives, especially for women working in bars and massage that are basically treated as sexual objects. Those are also points of for the trafficking networks that usually disguise the opportunities as jobs, taking advantage of an extremely vulnerable population, and mentioning that, again, those entry points increased with the COVID-19 restrictions. In terms of service for protection, even though there is a real effort in trying to provide the services and protection for migrants and refugees, unfortunately, those are not adequate or reach the needs, or to the level that they reach the needs. We have seen in all of the countries reports that the claims are often ignored, that the services and authorities that were supposed to be providing migrants and refugees support many times are the source of harassment and violence. And many of those who experience violence are afraid of reporting it because of possible reprisals and threat of deportation. Also, I think it's important to mention that we do need to consider in this crisis the services for protection of this population as part of the life-saving response, because those are extremely risky at this moment. I will enter now in the next slide the basic findings through the different sectors. First sector being health and sexual and reproductive health. What we see is that inside of Venezuela, even though there is some level of access to health, many, as you can see on the numbers, it's not satisfactory for the most of the population, and basically because there is lack of medication, supplies, infrastructure, so on and so forth. We have seen also that there is a gender division, especially in the countries that are receiving people, between the needs and the capacity to attend to health services in the countries. I don't know if there's something with the slide, but someone just reported that they can't see the slide. I don't know exactly why, just flagging that. So going back, for instance, in Ecuador, we know that 70% of women and 75% of LGBTIQ plus individuals reported needing healthcare versus 45% of the men. Nevertheless, the majority, 88% of women did not receive the care they needed versus 80% of men. Even though there is a gender issue, it is a very low level of access to health in the majority of the countries. What are the barriers for accessing the health services? Lack of money to cover the basic costs, discrimination, including, and we have reports of healthcare personnel refusing to provide services, lack of documentation, but also lack of information on how to access those services. Many sometimes are also afraid of reaching out to the health services because of xenophobia, or because they are afraid of being reported and sent back to their countries. In terms of sexual and reproductive health, family planning became a huge challenge. Contraceptives prices inside of Venezuela increased in 25 times. The public healthcare infrastructures are facing a shortage of most of the contraceptive methods. And that basically meant that many family planning options are now limited to operations, and it also led to an increase of unplanned and unwanted pregnancies. We are seeing a huge rise on the adolescent pregnancies, and the research participants in Venezuela that were pregnant reported that for most of them, the pregnancies were not planned. Maternity mortality rates have also increased since 2015. Lack of healthcare has been part of their motivation to migrate into other countries, and we can see gaps on knowledge on the gaps between the knowledge of how to use contraception, especially for Venezuelans that are arriving in the other countries. So they know that they need to use contraception. Nevertheless, the level of usage is low, especially because of the not having access to it. Finally, again, COVID has made the situation even more complicated. The mobility restrictions are now also a barrier for reaching the health services. Income for migrant and refugees is even lower with the economies being shut down in the countries, in the host communities and countries. And also what we've seen in the Zika, when we were responding to Zika and the Zika crisis, is that when there is a health crisis, the health funds are being directed to the response of the crisis, which means usually defunding some of the areas, and especially sexual and reproductive health. So we are extremely concerned that as funds are, directed to the COVID response, the SRHR services will be in an even worse shape. Regarding other sectors, shelter has been, in Venezuela, the majority of people have their own home, but outside of Venezuela, people are basically needing to rent spaces for shelter. We have seen that those shelters are usually not well structured and lack security precautions for many, and that may represent risks, especially for women and LGBTIQ+ populations. We have seen that the people that are in transit or en route, the majority had to sleep at least one night sleeping in the streets, and that's a higher number for men than women, because there is a idea of trying to protect women because they will be more vulnerable in the streets. But still, in Peru, for instance, almost 42% of the women that we researched had to sleep at least one night on the street. With COVID, we have seen many of those shelters being shut down because they did not allow the social distancing measures. And unfortunately, the population, migrants and refugees, having to move to live on the streets, which is one of the motivators of considering going back into Venezuela, as our teams are reporting now. In terms of food security, there is a major crisis faced inside of Venezuela and outside of Venezuela as well. The majority of people report that their income is not sufficient to buy food inside of Venezuela. And then there is an issue that women, including older women, report that they are prioritizing giving food for their children before eating themselves. So they are still even more vulnerable to the food security crisis right now. Prior to COVID, 35% of the households had already reduced the quantity of food, and also, and 32% had reduced the variety of food. And we know that that got worse with COVID. The coping strategies also vary by gender. So children in female-headed households are often sent to other families. So, the grandparents or someone who can help support and provide to them. And in male-headed households, it is more common to sell household goods to try and access economic resources. In terms of access to water, inside of Venezuela, only 30% approximately of the respondents had access to water through the public network, while 29% had to supply themselves through water tankers. And it's a higher charge of work for women that are living in houses without public access to water, because they basically have more hours allocated to the role of acquiring water as well. In the host countries, The majority reported having access to the public water network. But in Colombia, access to safe drinking water has really deteriorated in the border areas. And as you know, wash, of course, is always a fundamental sector, but with the COVID crisis, even more. So it has important implications as well. Many women have described that they are being forced to pay for access to water, even when it should not be that way, and finding it really difficult to pay for the even more basic menstrual hygiene needs that they have, which is a very specific but important need of in terms of hygiene for women. Next slide, please. In terms of the recommendations and conclusions, so there is a set of very practical and pragmatic recommendations in the document, and the ones that are here are better described or in more detail described there. But the first one is, of course, ensuring that all humanitarian action considers the unique needs of women, men, girls, boys, and LGBTQ population people that are facing intersecting vulnerabilities, and that we are able to defer those needs and attend to them in different ways. We recommend mainstreaming the key gender and protections approaches in line with the GBV principles and risk mitigation measures across all of the response sectors, including the sexual and reproductive health and rights, wash, shelter, food and nutrition security, and livelihoods, and other assistance modalities. We need to consider that protection and GBV related issues are life-saving, and they need to be targeted to the most vulnerable population. Ensure that there is meaningful participation of the crisis affected population, particularly women, girls, and LGBTIQ+ people, by actively including them on the decision-making spaces and actually supporting their leadership and generating these spaces for their leadership. And I think this is a huge call out from all of the many findings that we need to address very quickly. We need to strengthen the sexual and reproductive health response in line with the minimal initial service package in crisis settings. And that means scaling up life-saving as sexual and reproductive health services, training health providers in providing rights-based, trauma-informed approaches to service provision, building the capacity of the coordination mechanism, supporting the public health system, and advocating to the public health system to continue and maintain the funding continue and maintain the funding for sexual and reproductive health while responding to the crisis, and also increasing the access to menstrual and hygiene materials. Support cash and voucher assistance, income generating activities that are safe and dignified and give options to migrants and refugees, and also that are gender sensitive and based on gender sensitive market analysis and risk analysis, because as we saw, there is a gender difference on job offers and what does that mean for different groups. And finally, we do need to urgently ensure the availability of safe shelter and housing options, especially for women and girls that are traveling alone or with young children, and also address the food security and nutrition concerns, especially focusing on the vulnerability of women and girls that are on the move. Next. So key conclusions for us. One, the Venezuela crisis has worsened the gender gaps, affecting especially women, adolescent girls, and LGBTIQ+ individuals. The crisis has also led to changes in gender roles and responsibilities in both Venezuela and host countries. And while this has led to an increased burden on women and girls, who are often obliged to take on additional care tasks and perform the role of heads of the households in the crisis context, it also has led to an increased sense of agency and self-worth amongst Venezuelan women. And it is an opportunity to rediscuss, and with that happening, the gender roles and responsibilities and norms for the longer term. So I think that we do need to step into taking somehow advantage of this change to maintain the change without increasing the burden. In terms of migration, we know that the migratory process increases risks for adolescent girls and women, especially. They have seen adolescent girls, their access to education interrupted, and struggle to earn enough money to cover any of their basic needs. Many are vulnerable to marriage, early marriage, and sexual exploitation. We also are seeing that the irregular migration, that is, again, an even bigger problem with the COVID measures, represent a huge vulnerability factor that can limit not only access to employment, but also expose people to vulnerabilities such as being captured by criminal gangs or being victims of sexual and labor trafficking. Venezuelan migrants and refugees also face widespread xenophobic attitudes and attacks, with women and LGBTIQ+ individuals reporting a particularly high level of violence. Most people don't have the sufficient information about or access to the services for survivors, particularly for gender-based violence. And this has a particular impact in women, girls, and LGBTIQ populations. Where the services exist, they are often considered inadequate for migrants and refugee survivors because of some specific limitations and barriers that we mentioned before. Also, sexual and reproductive health needs are unmet, and we are seeing higher rates of maternal mortality, adolescent pregnancy, and lack of access to testing. We know that prior to the arrival of COVID, the migrant and refugee community lived in conditions of extreme poverty, in overcrowded rental accommodations, without adequate access to health services. All of that was actually made worse with the COVID-19 crisis, exposing migrants and refugees to an even higher level of poverty, but also vulnerability and risk. Finally, I think it's very worth mentioning that despite all of the issues that we just mentioned, the challenges and the risks, women are also showing tremendous resilience and leadership in the front line of the response. Gender-based violence service providers and authorities are showing new innovative ways of working and providing the services, and those are led by the gender-based services led by local women organizations. But we are seeing that COVID-19 can easily exacerbate and further estrange the existing gender inequalities for Venezuelan women and men in the region. On the other hand, it can also be a platform for local-led innovative ideas and opportunity to truly drive locally the response and leadership of to meet the needs. So I'll stop here so that we have the time for questions and answers. I know there's already some things in the chat, so I'll pass it over to you, Kata. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tati. And I also invite to the participants, if they are willing to ask some questions or even comments or reflections about the presentation and the content. I will start with the first question for you, Tati, and it's related to the indigenous population. So did you assess the specific situation of indigenous Venezuela population? And I think this is a question from Lydia Paola Espinosa.
And Kata, please jump in, as you've led much of the methodology on the RGA as well. But no, we haven't assessed the specific situation of indigenous Venezuela. It's one of the limitations of the work. We did have some indigenous populations being assessed now in the current RGA that we are leading in Colombia, in the Colombia border, but we have not had this as a specific group for our first round of the RGA. It is though foreseen in our new round, as I was mentioning. Kat, I don't know if you want to complement or go to the next.
Yes, I mean, as you mentioned, there is not a specific focus on indigenous women, but they took part of some of the focus group that we did specifically in Peru and Venezuela. But definitely this remains as a challenge, given the number, the broadly territory that we need to cover. But it's definitely a good element to include in the second round. So thank you for that. There is another question, Tati, that is related to the Peruvian situation, and please provide information on human trafficking and good practices on GBV in Peru. And this is also from Lidia Paola Espinosa.
So what we have seen in Peru is, in one hand, very complicated issues in the borders with human trafficking and with the vulnerabilities and risks for women and girls being exposed to trafficking, as in the other, sorry, just I need to take a glass of water just to keep talking. As we have seen in other borders as well, we have seen high reports of violence and sexual violence and transactional sex being used as an exchange for being able to cross, or as a part of the threats that if there are no sexual favors, there will be no, people will not be allowed to live or to settle in some of the places that they are arriving. What we are seeing as part of the good practices, or of at least what we are seeing in some of parts of the response in Peru specifically, is providing connection and information to the already established gender-based violence services for protection of the women. And a specific recommendation that is being done in parts of the countries, and that include Peru, is training the health services and some of the migration services to identify the cases of trafficking, and also identify cases of gender-based violence, so they are able to redirect the victims and survivors to the correct services. And we are also seeing challenges on the capacity of those services to attend to survivors, especially after COVID-19, as we know that there was a peak of gender-based violence with the restriction measures. But I don't know if you can complement as well.
Yes, for sure, Tati. One of the main actions that CARE has been leading, specifically in Peru and Ecuador, is strengthening the capacities for public servants that are related to the protection routes and how we can create those awareness. Trafficking is a huge challenge regarding the deepest networks that are related to this issue, involving in some of cases public servants or even police. So it's a pretty sensitive issue. We also face that there is not a lot of official data, given the lack of legal response and for sure the correcting address to those issues. But it's something that is a priority. First of all, because we need to visualize the real situation of the victims and survivors, but also create awareness is the best point of entry with migrants and refugees, that they are not aware about what it means trafficking or where they are part of a trafficking network. So working closely with local organizations once more is a real important tool, because they are part of the daily life of the migrants and refugees in the hosting communities. So that's something that we are trying to scaling up. It's always a lot of gaps that remain. Thank you so much. I wonder if there is another question or comment from the participants. Yeah, I think those were the main questions highlighted on the Q&A box. I don't know, Tati, if you have some final conclusion before we close the webinar today.
Yeah, so just first of all, again, thank you everyone for joining us. We have launched 3 weeks ago, if I'm not wrong, our COVID-19 regional RGA together with UN Women. And we are now launching this one specific for the regional crisis in Venezuela. I think that the difference with this one, and we are really excited about it, was our the possibility of actually having primary data interviews and focus groups. And there are detailed both on this report that has the regional trends, but also we have country by country reports. So for, I think it's Lydia, as you are very interested on Peru, be aware, and we can share the Peruvian RGA that has even more details about the data in the country. We will be conducting a second round of RGAs for both crises, and we expect to have then much better, much clearer linkages from COVID-19 impacts on the Venezuela crisis as well, as some of the dynamics reopen. Some of the countries reopen and see how that changes the dynamics. We are also going to look into some of the populations that we were not able to assess specific needs. One is the indigenous groups, but also we want to increase our capacity to evaluate LGBTIQ plus individuals' needs, because we know that it was a lower representation on this take of the RGA. So that those are groups that we have interest of, expanding and being able to learn more from. And hopefully we will also be able to add new countries to the RGA depending on our partnerships. It is, again, a very practical exercise that is done to help designing our programs and in our, expectancy of also helping design everybody's programs. So please download, use, share, copy, paste, just make use of the document as well, because that's the key intention of it, is providing information for us to be more effective as a humanitarian community. I finally just want to thank again and recognize the amount of work that was put in producing this information by all of the local partners and our teams. They are, they have been fundamental to finding information that was not, clear or as available before. So thank you everyone for that. And I hope that we'll see each other soon.
Thank you, Tati, and thank you all. We will share with you also, with the people that registered on the link shared by Danielle, the link to get access to the document in Spanish and English. And please reach us if you want to hear more about how to mainstream gender approach across the humanitarian response. Thank you so much.